This is Marcus Reid. Before we begin, subscribe, like and share, because some stories don't begin in darkness. They begin with dreams so bright that when they fall apart, the silence they leave behind feels colder than death itself. Ethan Alvarez believed that love and effort would be enough to build a future. At 29, he married Clara, a sweet woman with calm eyes who believed in him with a shy smile and encouraging words. During the first months of their marriage, Ethan felt more alive than ever. Working as an assistant at a logistics company, he saved every penny with a single thought: I'm going to give her the life she deserves. When he saw an opportunity to open his own small business, a repair shop specializing in quick service for popular cars, he saw it as a chance to prove he could be more than just an employee. He wanted to be a provider, a man of value. Clara smiled when he told him his plan, and even hesitantly, she agreed with a kiss and the words, "I trust you." These 4 words were etched in Ethan's mind like a silent vow of honor. And it was with this vow in his heart that he invested all his savings and even took out a loan in his name to open his workshop, Alvarez Auto Care. At first, it seemed like everything would be a success story. The first few days were busy, friends showed up to support, neighbors brought cars in for minor repairs, and Ethan worked late, returning home exhausted but smiling. He hugged Clara every night and said, "It'll work out, I promise." She smiled back, but over time, her smile slowly began to fade, replaced by silence and long stares into space. Because as Ethan struggled to grow, the bills mounted faster. A wrong part here, a defaulting customer there, small flaws that became large debts. The competition was stronger than he imagined, and rumors that his shop was weak began to circulate. Without realizing it, customers began to disappear. As Ethan tried to keep hope alive, Clara began to look at her husband with an expression he didn't understand at first, but would later recognize as the beginning of a goodbye. As the months passed, Ethan began to realize that each day felt like a race, and he was always late. He strove to keep the shop clean, tried to offer discounts, smiled even when tired, but business dwindled. Bank bills began arriving with overdue due dates. The loan he'd taken out weighed like a millstone around his neck. One day, Clara asked with that piercing calm, "You sure this will work?" Ethan answered with conviction, but only in his voice, because inside cracks were already forming in the once solid certainty. He began sleeping less, eating less, and blaming himself more. Clara began avoiding long conversations. She went out more often to think or visit her mother. The bed felt cold even when she was lying next to him, and Ethan, unwilling to admit it, began to fear that he wasn't just losing money, but the respect of the woman who had promised to believe in him. The downfall didn't happen on a single day. It built like a slow storm until everything collapsed at once. One rainy afternoon, a bank official showed up at the garage to notify him of a serious delay in his loan payment. 2 potential clients who were there left without a word. Ethan felt the ground shake within him. By the end of that week, he had to fire the only employee who still believed in the business. That same night, when he arrived home and tried to hug Clara, she pulled away slightly. She didn't scream, she didn't fight. She simply said, "I don't think I can keep betting on a dream that's dragging me down with it." Ethan froze. He asked, "Are you saying you're going to leave me?" Clara hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "I can't breathe in this failure." And that same night, she packed a small suitcase and left for her mother's house. There were no screams, no cries from her, just silence. And that was when Ethan realized the failure had stopped being financial and had become existential. After Clara left, the house became an echo of everything Ethan couldn't be. The dishes remained clean in the sink because he rarely had an appetite. The bed seemed larger, too cold, as if mocking the loneliness he tried to ignore. He kept trying to keep the shop open for a few more weeks, even though he knew he was only postponing the inevitable. Clients disappeared, debts mounted, and collection calls became more frequent. One day, upon answering the phone, hearing someone call him irresponsible, he simply hung up and stared at the wall for minutes that felt like hours. There was no more anger, no more fear, just a silent emptiness that weighed more heavily than any insult. The pride that once drove him was now a chain dragging him down. He began coming home so exhausted that he slept on the couch with his clothes on, without the energy to even cry. The humiliation reached its peak when the shop was officially closed by court. Order due to unpaid debts. Ethan watched as two people entered to seal the place. A red sign with stark letters was taped to the door. Activity suspended due to default. He stood there, clutching the key that no longer opened anything. A few neighbors watched from afar, murmuring among themselves. One of them, who had earlier praised his courage in undertaking the business, now shook his head as if to say, "I knew this would happen." Ethan didn't respond to anyone. He walked slowly home, feeling as if he was carrying on his shoulders not only the end of a business, but the collapse of his identity. That night, he received a short message from Clara. "I hope you recover, but I'm not coming back." There was no anger in that sentence. This hurt even more, because it showed she didn't even hate him. She had simply given up on him. And in that moment, Ethan realized that for some, he had already been dead for a long time. He just had to accept it himself. The following days dragged on, in a silent sequence of regret, anxiety, and self-accusation. Ethan began avoiding mirrors. He couldn't bear to look at the man who had failed so quickly. He tried looking for temporary jobs, but his mind couldn't focus. Some companies said he was overqualified. Others treated him as worthless for having failed as an entrepreneur. He ended up taking a casual job unloading boxes at a warehouse, paid by the day, just to try to keep the lights on at home a little longer. But something was broken. Inside him, even when his body moved, his mind seemed stuck in a specific point in time. The night Clara closed her suitcase without looking back. Every time he passed a street where couples walked hand in hand, he felt a tightness in his chest, as if the universe were constantly reminding him of what he had lost. Loneliness was no longer just the absence of people. It was the feeling that he had lost the right to believe in himself. The nights became his worst enemies. Ethan began to feel a weight on his chest that he couldn't explain. Sometimes he would just sit on the floor of his dark room, hugging his knees, trying to understand when everything had begun to fall apart. He wondered, if I had waited longer, if I hadn't taken out the loan, if I had been smarter, if I had been more of a man. These questions consumed him. He began drinking, not for pleasure, but to try to reduce the noise of guilt in his mind. One early morning, sitting in the living room with a nearly empty bottle, he murmured to the void, "Maybe everyone is better off without me." It was a phrase spoken almost as a sigh, but charged with deadly meaning. That same week he received a summons that his assets would be confiscated to pay off part of the debt. He looked around and asked himself with bitter irony, what assets? Does my shame count as assets? And it was then that the most dangerous idea of all began to emerge, albeit silently. Maybe the solution wasn't to fight. Maybe it was to simply disappear. The idea of disappearing began as a distant thought, then became a hypothesis, until, finally, it began to feel like a kind of liberation. Ethan felt like he had become a dead weight on the world, a still-breathing body whose purpose had been ripped out by the roots. Each morning he woke. The first sensation wasn't relief at being alive, but disappointment that he hadn't disappeared overnight. He tried to talk to an old friend, but the other kept his distance, clearly uncomfortable with the failure etched on Ethan's face. One phrase kept echoing in his head. "Man, you were my inspiration to try something in life. Now, I don't know, this scares me." Those words weren't spoken maliciously, but the consequences were devastating. If before, Ethan had seen himself as someone who had failed, now he saw himself as someone who dragged others down simply by existing. It was in this emptiness that he began to plan. There was no romanticizing it, just a practical end to a life he considered useless. One night, he grabbed his car keys and drove aimlessly, his mind numb and his heart numb. He ended up parking on a remote bridge where the icy wind cut his face like tiny blades. He stood near the railing railing, staring at the dark water below. He thought of Clara, not with anger, but with the painful knowledge that she had already moved on. He thought of his mother, who always told him he would be a source of pride, and hated himself for knowing that now he would be remembered as a disgrace. He felt his hands tremble as he leaned against the railing. He didn't cry. The tears had dried days ago. He simply whispered, "I did everything I could," a phrase that suicides often believe is their final confession. But at that very moment, before he could decide his next step, something unexpected happened. A stranger parked his car a few meters away, as if simply gazing at the same horizon. And even without saying anything yet, his silent presence would completely change Ethan's fate. The stranger didn't seem particularly impressive. He was a middle-aged man, dressed simply, with a tired yet strangely calm expression. He didn't ask anything right away. He simply leaned against the bridge railing, a few feet away from Ethan, and stared into the same dark void Ethan was staring at. It was as if he were there for a different reason, but at the same time, for exactly the same reason. For a few minutes, the silence between them was almost unbearable. Ethan tried to move, but felt something holding him back, not physically, but mentally, as if he couldn't take that final step while someone watched him. The man then spoke, without even turning his head. "If you're here for the same reason I was once, I warn you now, the water seems to offer peace, but it only brings regret to those who stay." Ethan didn't answer, but those words pierced him like a needle. The stranger slowly turned and looked into Ethan's eyes for the first time, and in that look, there was no pity, no judgment, only something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time: understanding. "If you jump," he said calmly, "you don't take away the pain. You just transfer it to someone who isn't ready to carry it." Ethan frowned in confusion. The man continued, "When I wanted to do this, my sister spent years thinking it was her fault. She stopped living, trying to understand why I didn't trust her. I thought I was freeing myself, but I almost destroyed the people who still loved me, even though I thought no one else cared." Ethan wanted to say something like, "No one would miss me," but something in the man's voice stopped him. It was the voice of someone who had been in that exact spot before and come back alive, but scarred. Without knowing why, Ethan took a step back, not because he was healed, but because he realized he still didn't fully understand what the man was trying to convey. And silently and fragilely, that was enough to stop him from jumping that night. Ethan remained motionless for a few seconds after he took the step back. There was no relief, there was no joy, just a strange feeling that he had postponed something he believed was inevitable. The stranger remained there beside him without getting too close. "My name is Gabriel," he said simply, as if offering not salvation, but the possibility of a conversation he wasn't sure he wanted to have. Ethan hesitated before answering in a scratchy voice. "Ethan." Gabriel simply nodded, as if knowing. That name was laden with history, shame, and weariness. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, until Gabriel said something that stuck in Ethan's mind like a scar. "I can't stop anyone from jumping. I can only remind you that if you die a failure, you'll never have the chance to discover if you could have been reborn differently one day." Gabriel didn't say, "You will win." He didn't say, "Everything will get better." He simply spoke of the possibility of a rebirth, which at that moment seemed as distant and impossible as a new dawn. Gabriel then stepped away and said, "I come here sometimes just to remember where I almost ended, and to thank you for keeping going. If you want to talk, I'll be here tomorrow. If you don't, I'll understand." And he left. Ethan remained on the bridge for a few more minutes, the wind beating against his face and his mind reeling. He didn't know if he wanted to keep living. He didn't know if he had the strength to try again, but he knew, almost imperceptibly, that tonight would be different from the others. When he returned home, he didn't turn on the light. He sat on the living room floor, unable to lie down in bed, and for the first time in weeks, he cried, not as someone seeking pity, but as someone who discovered they were still capable of feeling something other than emptiness. He hadn't been saved. He had merely been interrupted, and in this fragile state, this small difference could be the beginning of a new journey. The next morning, Ethan woke with heavy eyes and a dry throat. The sun streamed through the window, but it didn't seem to bring light, just a reminder that he still existed. He got up slowly, his body aching as if he'd been through a battle no one saw. As he walked to the bathroom, he avoided the mirror, as he had for the past few days. He washed his face with cold water, but he didn't feel awake. He was still numb, as if he walked with an invisible burden. He sat on the empty sofa and stared at the floor for long minutes. He hadn't died, but neither did he know how to live. The question hammering at his head was one he'd never seriously considered. What do I do now? Before, his life had had a plan, to build something with Clara, to be someone. Now, everything had fallen apart. And worst of all, he didn't know who he was without that dream. He didn't want to return to the bridge, but he also had no reason to go anywhere else. Yet something inside him, perhaps a remnant of pride, perhaps a subtle curiosity about what Gabriel had seen after giving up, made him leave the house. There was no set destination, just slow steps toward nothingness. Before he realized it, he was returning to the bridge. He didn't know if Gabriel would be there. Part of him hoped he wouldn't be. Another part, the more wounded part, desperately wished he were. To his surprise, Gabriel was there, leaning against the railing again, as if waiting not impatiently, but understandingly. When Ethan approached, Gabriel didn't ask how he was. He just gave a slight nod, as if to say, "You came, that's something." They sat in silence for several minutes, until Ethan, his voice low and broken, said, "I didn't jump, but I don't know what to do now." Gabriel took a deep breath and replied calmly, "You don't need to know. Knowing isn't the first part. The first part is being able to get up every day without hating your own existence. Then we'll see the rest." Ethan didn't know if that was advice or a simple observation, but for the first time, he felt that maybe there was room to start over, even if he didn't yet know how. Gabriel didn't try to motivate Ethan with speeches about success or hope. He spoke like someone who had fallen before and knew that getting back up wasn't an epic feat. It was an exhausting process, made up of small steps. Realizing Ethan was listening, even in silence, he said, "When I gave up on dying, I didn't become a strong man. I became a survivor. Only over time did I discover that surviving was a way to start over." These words didn't make Ethan smile, nor did they fill him with hope, but something about them was real, honest, unlike the empty phrases of people who said, "It'll be okay," without understanding anything. In the days that followed, Ethan began returning to the bridge, not to die, but because there was someone there who didn't see him as a failure or as someone with something to prove. Gabriel never asked about Clara or the workshop or how Ethan had gotten there. He only told pieces of his story little by little, never completely, as if to say, "I don't need to open up completely for you to understand that I was once broken." One morning, upon arriving at the bridge, Ethan found Gabriel with a small bag containing 2 plain coffees. Gabriel handed one to Ethan and said, "If you're here again, then you've already begun without realizing it." Ethan frowned. "Started what?" Gabriel replied calmly. "The art of continuing." The phrase seemed strange, even vague, but Ethan absorbed it like someone trying to relearn how to breathe. They talked about random things, the weather, the noise of the city, childhood memories. It was strange, but also comforting. Ethan realized that, for the first time in weeks, he had spoken aloud without each word feeling like a weight like iron. It wasn't happiness, nor redemption, but it was less dark. When he returned home that day, he realized he still felt empty, but a little less condemned. And when he lay down to sleep, the idea of dying still lingered, but it had been pushed back a few steps by something new and fragile. The thought that maybe there was a way to live without hating himself. Ethan realized that staying alive required movement, even small, even imperfect. So it started with the bare minimum: waking up, showering, walking to the bridge. Gabriel didn't talk about the future, only about tomorrow. And this concept began to make sense to Ethan. He didn't need to figure out who he would be in 10 years. He just needed to survive tomorrow. Over time, Gabriel shared that he had worked as a carpenter before his emotional downfall. Little by little, he had returned to fixing small things, not to make money, but because creating something with his own hands made him feel like he could still transform something around him. This idea stuck in Ethan's mind. He remembered that, before his failure, he enjoyed fixing small things: a stuck door, a broken piece of furniture, an old radio. That's how, a few days later, he got out of bed and opened a box of old tools left over from the workshop. There was no financial plan, no ambitious project. He simply picked up a broken chair that had been abandoned in the living room and began repairing it. The process was slow and painfully simple, but when he finished, even if it was just a crooked, patched chair, he looked at it and felt something small, but real. I still know how to do something. Emboldened by that small act, Ethan began offering inexpensive repairs to neighbors, not as an entrepreneur trying to grow, but as someone trying to find his way back into usefulness. Some people accepted, others hesitated due to past reputations. Each yes was a small victory. Each no hurt, but it didn't destroy him as it once did. Gabriel accompanied him through this process, not as a mentor, but as a steadying presence. He never praised him out of enthusiasm, just saying short phrases like, "You're still going." Little by little, Ethan began talking about Clara. Not with anger, but with sadness. He admitted he didn't hate her. He just felt she had given up on him, the way he had given up on himself. Gabriel listened and replied, "Sometimes people leave because they're afraid to watch us fall, but the only person who truly needs to stay is ourselves." These words didn't heal Ethan, but they kept him from wanting to die that day. And so, day after day, repair after repair, conversation after conversation, he began to realize that perhaps life wasn't about rebuilding what he'd lost, but about learning to exist differently after the fall. A few weeks passed, and Ethan didn't immediately realize that anything had changed. There wasn't a specific day when he woke up feeling better. The change happened in quiet details. The weight in his chest no longer came as soon as he opened his eyes. The desire to no longer exist still appeared occasionally, but now it was a flickering flame, no longer a blaze. He returned to the bridge whenever he felt like he might slip, but he no longer stood still staring at the water. Now he sat beside Gabriel and talked, even if it was about small things. Gabriel said that deep down he never tried to save anyone. He just stood there so others would realize they weren't the only broken people in the world. Ethan listened and thought that maybe he too could one day be that kind of presence for someone. One day, as he was finishing repairing an old piece of furniture for a neighbor, she said, "You have good hands, don't give up on them." It was a simple phrase, but it echoed in his mind for the rest of the day. For the first time since his bankruptcy, Ethan realized someone had spoken to him not as a failure, but as someone who still had value. Over time, new orders came in, small repairs to houses in the neighborhood. It wasn't enough money to rebuild everything, but it was enough to fill his mind with purpose again. Gabriel suggested, "Don't try to be big again. Just try to be honest with yourself. Ethan understood that the downfall hadn't happened because he dreamed, but because he had tied his entire identity to success. Now he was learning to live without having to prove anything to anyone. One day he saw Clara from afar on the street. She was accompanied by someone else, seemingly calm and moving on with her life. Ethan felt a tightness, a silent ache, but not a collapse. He realized he still loved her somehow, but he no longer wanted to die because of her. That night, he returned to the bridge and said to Gabriel, "I think I'm still broken, but I'm not bleeding anymore." Gabriel smiled for the first time since they met and replied, "That's how healing begins. Not when the pain goes away, but when it no longer holds you back." And that night, Ethan understood that, even with scars, he was becoming someone new. Not the man he dreamed of, but perhaps someone more real. As the months passed, Ethan realized something he had never understood before. He didn't need to go back to who he was before the fall, because that man had been destroyed. Everything he had built with pride, the idea of being the perfect provider, the family success, the ideal husband, was actually a mask of validation. Now, working on small repairs and helping neighbors, he wasn't building a career, but rebuilding his own dignity, step by step. Gabriel kept showing up on the bridge, always in the same place, even when Ethan no longer went there out of desperation, but out of connection. One day, while they were talking, Gabriel said, "When I survived my worst night, I thought I was starting over. But the truth is, I was just continuing, only with more humility." Ethan identified deeply with this. He understood that his life wasn't starting over, it was being rediscovered. He still carried pain. There were still burning memories, but they no longer determined his destiny. One day, a client asked him if he could teach her son, a shy and insecure teenager, to repair small furniture as a form of therapy and discipline. Ethan hesitated, because he didn't see himself as worthy of teaching anything. But Gabriel encouraged him with a short phrase. "You already know how to mend wood. Now you just need to learn how to mend people, starting with yourself." Ethan accepted. During the lessons, he realized that each time he taught the boy how to fix something broken, he too was rebuilding himself a little inside. And that was how he understood something fundamental. He hadn't survived to restore his workshop, but to become someone who understood the pain of falling and who could help others not give up in the abyss. That night, when he returned home, he sat alone. But this time, the silence wasn't an enemy. It was just silence. And for the first time, he whispered a phrase he never imagined saying, "I'm not cured, but I'm alive." And that now is enough. Over time, the shy teenager Ethan helped began to improve, not just in his woodworking skills, but in his demeanor, in the way he talked to himself. One day, after successfully repairing an old chair on his own, the boy looked at Ethan and said, "I thought I was useless, but now I think maybe I was just broken in the wrong place." These words hit Ethan like an emotional mirror, because he understood that just a few months ago, he himself was that boy, someone lost, believing he had irreversibly failed. That night, Ethan returned to the bridge alone, and for the first time, looked out at the water not with a desire to disappear, but with a strange feeling of gratitude. Not gratitude for what he had suffered, but for having survived. He realized that the bridge had not been the end of his road, but the very point where his collapse ceased to be a grave and became a crossroads. Gabriel remained his silent anchor until one morning when Ethan arrived and found him missing. Where he usually leaned, there was only a small wooden box with a handwritten message. Now it's your turn to be here when someone needs to be seen. Inside the box was an old pocket watch and a simple note. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It means no longer living inside the fall. Ethan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Gabriel hadn't disappeared. He had simply left the space that Ethan now knew how to fill. That day, he sat on the bridge, not as someone needing to be saved, but as someone willing to listen. And even if no lost souls showed up that night, Ethan knew he was ready. He wasn't a failed businessman, nor was he just an abandoned husband. He was someone who had accepted that breaking isn't the end. It's a chance to learn how to put yourself back together more truly. A few weeks later, Ethan decided to visit Clara for the first time since his departure, not to ask her to return, nor to blame her, but to bring closure to something deep inside. He found her in front of her mother's house, more serene than in the days she left him. When she saw him, she expressed surprise, perhaps a hint of guilt, perhaps fear of being confronted. But Ethan wasn't there to shatter her peace. He was there to say something he could only now sustain without crumbling. In a calm voice, he said, "I don't hate you. I was just saddened that you gave up on me at the worst moment of my life. But I also gave up on myself before that. So I won't blame you anymore for running when you saw me falling." Clara stared at him, confused, trying to understand if there was any hidden resentment. Ethan continued, "I'm not okay, but I'm alive, and I'm trying to find myself again. Thank you for loving me when you could, and for leaving when you thought you couldn't anymore. Now I'm moving on, not to prove anything to you, but because I finally want to live for myself, not to be the man you expected." She didn't answer. She just let out a silent tear. And in that exact moment, Ethan realized he had finally released a weight he'd been carrying since the day she left. That night, when he returned home, Ethan opened the small toolbox he used for his repairs and looked at it with a new feeling. Not as a symbol of failure, but as a bridge to what he had become. A fixer, even if slowly. He sat on the porch as the sky darkened and watched the city lights in the distance. He still felt fear. He still felt pain. But now he also felt purpose. And purpose, to someone who had once been on the brink of disappearing, was more valuable than any successful business. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, allowing himself to feel, for the first time since the fall, a small glimmer of pride. Not for having won, but for not having faded. And in that instant, he knew his story wouldn't end on the bridge, but would begin there, as someone who now knew that living is also an act of courage. The following months weren't easy. Ethan didn't miraculously transform into a happy man. There were days when he woke up with no desire to talk to anyone. Days when the weight of everything he'd lost still pressed down on his chest. But there was a difference. Before, the pain had drowned him. Now, he knew how to float in it. And some days, he could even swim a little. He expanded his small home repair business, not to get rich, but to stay active. Eventually, he started a volunteer community project, teaching young people with no prospects how to fix broken objects as a form of therapy. In every piece of splintered wood, in every crease of damaged metal, Ethan He told them, "Brokenness isn't the end. It's only the end when you think it's not worth fixing." And in every look from a boy who found value in what he'd rebuilt with his own hands, Ethan saw a reflection of his own survival. He never returned to the bridge out of desperation, but sometimes he'd pass by and leave a coffee on the railing, for Gabriel, or perhaps for someone who still needed to understand that jumping wasn't the only option. 30. One day, as he walked home at dusk, Ethan saw children playing in the street and laughing loudly. For a moment, he stopped to watch them, and something inside him warmed. It wasn't euphoria, nor explosive happiness. It was just peace. A mature peace, marked by scars, but entirely true. He understood that he would never again be the man he tried to be, and that no longer bothered him, because he had found a truer path, to be someone who, after falling and nearly disappearing, chose to continue existing with dignity. When he got home, he dropped his tools in the corner, looked out the window at the sunset, and whispered, not as a cry of victory, but as a simple truth, "I'm still here." And now, that wasn't a phrase of resignation, but of rebirth. This was Marcus Reid, and sometimes the greatest victory isn't about rising higher than before, but about surviving the fall and learning to walk again, even with scars.